Andrew Cuomo showed up yesterday morning. No.
Good picture of them.
He likes to come visit us. So, same here. This time we start, just let him do it all. His office anyway.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the highest profile person.
It's time consuming though.
Okay, you're screaming. That's not this. Oh, okay, yeah. I thought I said you can sit it right there.
Oh, okay, perfect.
Oh, you got one.
Yep, we're gonna, yep.
You want this down?
Oh,
Then smash it first.
okay, that's okay, I can finish it. Nothing that can't be compressed.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
That's my pleasure.
The second session Saturday card.
Don't do it in front.
You're all good,
I'm
right?
good.
What are we gonna do up front?
You're set.
Yeah,
You
I'm
got
good.
enough
I
space
just
on
finished
here?
it. Yeah, we got
All
to
right.
do an hour.
Good. All right. Can you start your stream? My man, thank
Thank you.
you.
No, thank you.
All right.
What? So it's nice to have friends that show up to your presentation.
Oh, I've got questions. Brace yourself.
We hopefully have answers.
I do.
You sure they're not just practicing? No, someone having a discussion and a presentation of. You can walk into the room. You're not gonna disturb anybody.
Because we do have a plan to.
For the,
I'm not sure, because our one is actually connected to the system, so it might work with anybody's zone. Why don't you let you see it just in case?
Okay, sure.
You can leave it on your phone if you want.
Oh. Yeah, this is what I'm doing.
Because it's connected to my system, so I thought it worked with anything.
Yeah.
The last paper I have to do.
Okay, well,
That's fine.
This is why we downloaded the Keynote apps.
I like that, yeah, well prepared.
We try.
Y'all doing
We're just trying to figure out if there's a laser pointer.
It's all her
well,
language.
I got laser, like, just want to use laser. You can use the laser on here, but it ain't, it'd be really double.
It's double picture.
I'm double fisted with the pointers.
Exactly.
I'm double fisted today, but it's just pointer.
Don't get all crazy.
Okay.
Oh, shit, I want to get some drink. I'll get y'all some of the drink or something.
I'm good. I brought, yeah.
I have that
Thank you
Oh,
very
I
much.
get another one, huh?
I'm good, but thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
It's rugby, Joe. Two apps.
Okay, I started streaming.
Green church over.
I mean, just controlling the
Actually, that's great.
Which I want them higher, all we gotta do is, I could twist them and make them taller. The
I'm
chairs.
just gonna bring them over to the side.
Okay,
Is that how it works?
yeah, these chairs right here, you just twist them around to get higher and higher and higher. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I'm gonna,
I said he's coming.
No, I'm gonna-
He's on there.
I'm gonna do that one. Okay. Let's test this one. Okay, perfect.
Yeah, yeah.
Here.
And I'm
Jim,
Jenny.
Jim, nice to meet y'all, pleasure to meet you today. Put it in your pocket or wherever you want to put it.
Yeah, let's see, does it pick me up from,
I can hear you.
this is perfect, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't want it to get too close, so we don't get too.
I can make it louder from here where you want to get close if you want. I can make it louder from this side, it's up to you.
I think that's the right height for. Okay.
Let's follow wide, it's not that deep. Want to go to the back and see if I can hear you?
I think it's fine. I'm gonna leave it off for the moment, and I'll put it back on. It's my turn to speak. We're still waiting for the other party to show.
There we go. And you have it on, the letter last for your song session.
Well, I don't wanna leave any comments.
Smart, yeah. I don't understand. Exactly, sometimes they catch you.
That's right.
That's true.
Yes.
Oh, like on somewhere else, like on News Channel 7.
That's right. Exactly, exactly.
When the University of Florida.
I'm so confused.
From University of Florida? Oh, I'll leave it for it.
It's hot.
And humid.
It's killing me. I'm not going to Florida these days.
It was in the 90s
It's,
when we left.
yeah, it was 90, yesterday was 90, and it's, yeah, it's,
I'm in the 70s degree.
it's thick, yeah.
I miss the Great Lakes State, because I grew up in Ohio. So I miss that kind of weather.
So you like what? I mean, you know,
I don't miss the winters, but I miss the summers.
what is our group?
Yeah, that's the only thing, yeah.
I feel this the Lake Effect now, because I grew up right on Lake Erie.
Oh, this is crazy. You been Florida yet?
Yeah.
You in Florida
So
yet?
I am, yes.
I've never been to Florida, though. That's since my not big deal. Go,
You would like it in the winter.
Yeah.
It's really nice in the
Like,
winter.
about middle of October, is when they get
yeah, that's probably,
and low,
probably one
low,
week.
low humidity. Yeah, that's what, well, that's when some of the snowbirds started. Who were there?
And then come back to where they do
My,
something smart.
where my parents were, they were just out there. They were pretty much. Snowbirds didn't go too well, and yeah, they were.
So you got the house here.
Well, my parents.
We're doing everything we're doing based on. And we're staying on the camera.
Yes, this is a nice picture.
Oh, definitely.
Yes, sir. Good.
Doesn't have much.
We don't have that. Mind if I borrow the lab? Yes, sir. Just want to look there, please.
How's everybody doing?
That's the deal. Take right here.
Hi. So, we're gonna give everybody mics. Are there 3 presenters for this group? Okay. So, yeah, we'll give 2 of you labs, and whoever's the loudest speaker can just kind of talk behind this when convenient. If there's a room mic, so if you're a loudspeaker, it shouldn't be a problem, but we like to give everyone labs just in case. So I guess I'll just give it to you two. You're in.
I already looked
Okay.
up, he asked for them.
Did you guys?
Oh, you want that?
Is this somebody's?
You want one? From Brent, you want?
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, I can speak up, I mean, if you'd rather have a lab, I'm loud.
If they're room mics, I'm not worried about it.
Okay, there's a room mic on the, well, it's basically a camera mic. It's a mic on the camera.
That's fine. So,
But you said you're a stationary speaker too, right? For the most part, so. And it's.
Now, let me check the audio level and see how much I'm
Sarah
getting.
said she's a very stationary speaker, so she can use the stationary.
okay, then I'll just use live, that's
I'm
fine.
pretty, I'll go around to that
But anyway, when I
Was he recording that?
The audio levels are good on all of you, so just project and you should be fine. All right, have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
I feel it.
What?
You can attest to the fact that I'm a loudmouth.
You want to be the He's going to get him.
Great, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I don't think in my life anyone ever said to me, louder. So, the only question I had is, with the camera, how far is the field of view?
Well, this has all y'all right now. It's from the end of the board.
Okay. So we get the
Almost,
board.
yeah, I got all you.
So if I pace a little.
It's a lot of space over here, though, if you ever want to move over this. See, it'll be your left, my right.
Yep.
Yeah.
Does anyone else need a water? You're okay? Is everything-
Thanks, Jared.
No problem.
Good luck, sir. Thank you. Yeah. I think that works. I think it's 12:58. Where are we, until 2? What? A little bit. I'll leave it to you. Voice on high. Am I killing anybody in the back? Just want to make sure it's not too loud.
That's good.
All right. Of course.
Okay, sorry.
No problem. Okay, we'll see this thing. Okay, we are going to get started on time, I think. So thank you, excuse me, and welcome to our session, Up in the Clouds, Forecasting Legal Education Challenges and Opportunities for Data Big and Small. We are going to talk today both about the benefits of data and analytics and what we can get within our institutions and what we can do with all that information, as well as some of the challenges, some of the risks, and specifically the privacy laws that impacts on education. We thought we'd introduce ourselves first. I'm Jonathan Ezor. I am assistant professor at Touro College Jacob B. Fuchsberg Law Center in Central Islip, which is on Long Island in New York, and the director of our Center for Innovation in Business Law and Technology.
I am Jenny Wondrasik. I am head of research and faculty services, soon to be head of e-services and technology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Carrie Maddox. I'm the Assistant Dean for Student Affairs at the University of Florida in Gainesville.
For a reminder of those of you who are Twitter users, the hashtag is CaliCon13. Our slides, I think, will all be made available on the Cali website at some point in the very near future, and this is being streamed, we're told, and will be available, I think, afterwards on YouTube, Cali YouTube channel. This is not working, so I'm just going to do this. Okay. Let me start by saying that it is somewhat ironic for me to be standing here with a PowerPoint about data and analytics, given what's gone on this week in the news, particularly about a certain PowerPoint having gone missing from the government about data and analytics. So when I say it's the trendiest trend in business, big data, of course it's not just business, it's also government. We all understand that information per se does not lead to knowledge. That's true for our students, and it's true for ourselves as well. We have huge, huge piles of information available to us in every context, whether it's, and then what do we do with it? We're separating the wheat from the chaff, looking for a needle in a haystack, worrying that one rotten apple of data might spoil the bunch, or pick your other agricultural metaphor to use, but we need understanding. We need understanding to get knowledge in order to innovate, which is the theme of this conference. And that's not a new concept. The idea of looking at data, of looking at results, obviously comes out of science, but if you think about it in business, and we can have a separate talk about whether legal education is or should be a business, but certainly there are lessons to be learned. If you look in the direct marketing field, the idea of A/B testing, of being able to try different approaches and know from how those approaches are formatted, the extension people are supposed to call, whatever, what worked and what didn't, and try to figure out why in order to get better at it the next way. If you are so inclined and you're interested in business and learning about how to do it and how to innovate, let me recommend a book that has been recommended to me, Eric Ries's book, The Lean Startup. There are, although it is not about education, there's very little about education in the book, there are a lot of really good lessons, including the need to do testing, to look at information and use it in order to innovate in business. So, highly recommend it. And when we're talking about taking that information, we're talking about analytics. Piles of data, going through them, looking not only for the useful pieces of information, but also sifting them, sorting them, combining them, analyzing them to see trends, to see past trends. What did we do? What happened? Why did it happen? What don't we realize was true about the things that have gone before? And looking forward. How can we use what we know to do what we're doing better? We go back to our archives. We may take sample data sets and try something against them. What if this happened? And especially in the business world, where there are pieces of information being generated in real time, analytics as well is happening in real time. That these data are not just being dumped on the relevant professionals, but they are being filtered through tools to give useful snapshots of what's going on. Sales by region, response rate to a particular marketing campaign. In the internet era, advertising literally can change based on information coming in real time. An ad can be changed in real time and go out to the world. And we have numerous tools available to us and to the world in order to properly handle this mountain of data and analyze it properly. Some of the tools we have already. Tools like Microsoft Excel and the relevant OS X equivalents, with different kinds of charts and analyses and formulas. And if you don't know how to create a particular formula, it's probably available online as a template for you to take and modify. There are also very specialized tools for particular industries, for particular data types. So let me show you what I'm talking about. Let me show you a real-world, almost real-time, because I actually had to get this morning to have it in the slide, example of an analytics from this event. As I said when we started, the hashtag for this event is CaliCon13. If you're not a Twitter user and you've heard, excuse me, you've heard this, but maybe aren't sure why this is a hashtag. The hash part is, I guess, British English, what we would call a pound sign or a tic-tac-toe board. And in Twitter, and as of, I guess, yesterday, Facebook and Instagram and some of the other social networks, in order to differentiate between using a word, I mean, obviously CaliCon13 is not a word, but something like privacy, those of us who are involved in data privacy education, in order to separate the use of the word privacy in a sentence from saying, I'm talking about privacy, the topic, we include the hashtag privacy with that pound sign to enable easy searches. And not just searches, but following. So that I have on my computer, in the software I use to view Twitter, I have a search column. And in real time, as someone new tweets tweets using the privacy hashtag, a new entry comes up. And so even though Twitter is this very diverse service, it's as if I've got a private channel just about privacy. I'm not necessarily following. I don't know who's posting, but we're all posting with this particular topic. So in order to track all the tweets from those of us who are tweeting about this conference, we've designated a unique, and you always have to check that. It gets very embarrassing when you use one that's for a totally different topic. Hashtag CaliCon13. Now, if you've gone through the social media discussion, return on investment is always a big question. How much should we put into this in time and money and tools and staff? And how do we know what we're spending is generating anything? And that is a question for analytics. It turns out that there are a number of tools specifically for social media analytics. I have been fortunate enough, this is the FTC required disclosure, I guess, I've been fortunate enough for a number of years to be blessed with a free quote-unquote beta account that still runs, thank you very much, to the folks at SocialPane, which has morphed into a company that does a lot of these analytics. They also have a very nice Tweetball product. That's the end of the non-paid commercial. But because I still have access to this free account, I set up tracking for the CaliCon13 hashtag in order to do some analytics. I was curious. And so what we have here is the chart as of about 2.5 hours ago, tracking one particular measurement of the CaliCon13 hashtag. And that is unique reach, which means in the parlance of SocialPane, from yesterday through whatever time this morning, how many different Twitter users saw at least one tweet with the hashtag CaliCon13? How many were reached by those of us who were trying to talk about the conference? And I know you can't really see it from there, but I will tell you that the tweets hit something, if I'm counting these right, about 60,000 different Twitter users saw at least one tweet about this conference. How did that happen? Because if you take my followers and someone else's followers where they don't intersect, and you add them all up, 60,000 people saw one tweet. And another about 15 to 20,000 saw it when someone else repeated one of those tweets. 70,000 people, 70,000 unique users saw a tweet, saw a message on Twitter about this conference in the last 2 days. That's an important piece of data. It's an important piece of data about reach. That's why it's the unique reach. Impact. You're trying to decide, is it worth it to use Twitter to get this message out? Well, 50,000 people are seeing something, or 70,000 maybe, are seeing something about Cali and this conference. Considering there are only a few hundred of us here, that's not a bad ratio. That's what analytics can do in a very specific example. But what about us? What about us in legal education? You can certainly see it in business. You can certainly see it in the government. But how should we be using analytics? We generate a lot of information. And just think of the entire process of the life cycle of the law student. Recruiting, admissions, not the same thing, right? Where did I go? We have my colleague who runs our recruiting, makes trips all over the country, goes to law school fairs, goes to bar LSAT review sessions, is hitting a lot of places, meets a lot of people. How many of those turn into applications and then to admissions? And we all know the admissions criteria and the numbers and all that stuff. And then while the students are in our institutions, all those academic numbers, number of students, number per course, grade curve, grade, GPA, bar pass rate, first time bar pass rate, January, February bar pass, June, July bar pass. Look at the magazine, there it is. Employment during school, after school. And what about our alumni? Who are they? Where are they working? How much are they making? How do we find them to try to bring them back in? And let's not forget the external stuff. What is being said about us in the world? In traditional media, do you have a tickler file? Or does your marketing agency or communications department have a tickler file? Every time you show up, your school shows up in traditional media and on social media. All of these are data points or data sets. And the reality is, many of us, most of us, are not doing much with these data. And if we are doing something, it's the basics. What's our bar pass criteria? How many of our graduates? The kinds of things that show up on the, whether it's the ALS stuff or all those other surveys, things we have to disclose, things that show up on various blogs. But those are very basic, single point kinds of analytics. We're not doing much. And there's a huge opportunity. Missed opportunities, and we all know we're not in the smoothest, most promising, growth-guaranteed framework right now. And just as businesses in a competitive environment are using data and analytics to better position themselves, so too should we be. Here's an example, something we've discussed. Many of our schools, certainly ours, make an effort to connect students with practitioners as adjuncts and sending them out. We call them externships because we're sending them out. It's like immigrant, right? We bring in adjuncts not only because they can teach specific practice-related topics and setting aside the economics of an adjunct, but because it gives more contact between our students and those lawyers who might hire them, mentor them, guide them, advise them, etc. The same with the externships. The same, we moved our school to be next to a federal and state courthouse, largely to try to welcome in judges and practitioners into the building, and happily it's worked. But we're trying to connect our adjunct practitioners with students in order to get them jobs and to get them good jobs. But what we don't, and if we're successful, then our alumni are happy. And they're happy with us for making that possible, and hopefully they're generous with us, or to us for making that possible. But what's working? Analytics will allow us, and would allow you, to say, okay, this student had this externship. And look, 5 years later, this student is working at that firm. So let's go back to this student and say, you remember us? We gave you your first exposure, and now you're there, a mid-level associate or soon-to-be partner. Don't you appreciate what we're doing? Help us do that for more students. But in order to do that, we've got to match externship or adjunct faculty exposure, or even programmatic exposure, to jobs. So one is in the context of maybe the clinical department or the academic department or student services, and one may be in alumni affairs. Are they talking to each other? Do they use compatible systems? Well, so great, wonderful. It's like all the other things we're hearing at this conference. We are all talking about the great, wonderful things we can and should be doing, except that they're hard. And they're hard for a number of reasons, and this is also one of those things that is good to do and is difficult. We have institutional buy-in challenges. The mere notion to some that the academy, not a wonderful phrase, the academy might lower itself to using business analytics tools strikes some as being somehow improper. Remember when attorney advertising was also considered improper? Some people still consider it that way, but it's happening. And this has to happen too. We have, and you've heard this phrase, and I know I'm back to my agricultural metaphors, silos. Different departments have their own sets of data. They may be redundant, but whether or not they are, they may not be connected. Does your development office connect with your clinical department, connect with your admissions or your recruiting, and match people up? Even if they want to, can they? Are there data in compatible systems, in compatible formats? Are the names in the same way? Here are the people in your organization who know how to do this, both on the statistical side and the technological side. And what do you want? Yep. Yep, I know, got my watch right there. What do you want to know? What's useful to you? There's lots of questions to be answered. Which ones would be valuable? What does it cost to do? Great, we want to do it, but we're cutting budget because we're cutting admission. Or because we need to cut our budget. We can't afford these tools. We can't afford people to support them. It would be nice, wouldn't it? It would be a great thing to do. It goes on the what-if shelf. And we'll talk more about this a little later on, there are privacy concerns and privacy restrictions. Not necessarily as many as you would think, not necessarily in the places you would think, but they do exist. So we're going to talk about those privacy rules. And as I've said, there are a lot of different tools out there. But I want to make sure before I finish that I let you know, in case you don't, about something that I discovered that we're now sort of thinking about how do we use it. And this comes from the fact that big corporations like to do good. I don't mean only they like to do well, they do. But they like to do good, and they set up foundations for doing good. And one such corporation happens to be Salesforce.com, which is a very well-known, well-respected customer relationship management platform used by a lot of big companies and their salespeople. That's hence the name. Not cheap. Really isn't cheap. Very powerful analytics, which you can imagine for a Salesforce are important. But did you know that there is a Salesforce Foundation? And did you know that because there is a Salesforce Foundation and we are in the not-for-profit academic world, some of you perhaps are in the for-profit academic world, but generally speaking, we are entitled to some free licenses. Something on the order of 10 seats per institution, for free. If you go to salesforcefoundation.org/highered, you will find out more about it. Also, salesforcefoundation.org/powerofus. And those are free of charge. And there are communities, online communities for supporting. Clearly, Salesforce wants us to buy more than 10 licenses, but you can do a lot to start with just 10. And maybe you use other systems, like Razor's Edge, for development, for fundraising. Well, it turns out Salesforce, although this is not a free tool, but if you have a Razor's Edge database and you have a Salesforce license, there are tools out there, such as this one, I don't know anything about it other than I found it online, for integrating Razor's Edge and Salesforce. So the idea is you have some of these tools already. You can get others for low or no cost, other than time and knowledge and thought. And so even if you're not ready to implement a full analytics program, these kinds of opportunities allow you a proof of concept to take some of your data and do some analyses and come up with some information you didn't have before or you didn't know you had. That may then lead you into further explorations of how to get from piles of data to solid, usable strategies. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I turn the lectern over to my co-presenters. Thank you. And we'll have time for questions at the end.
Okay, good afternoon. We're shifting gears slightly, but as Jonathan was talking about, certain privacy regulations and certain privacy considerations that we need to have when we are working with big data. And specifically, what we're really going to focus on here as part of Jenny's and my presentation is we're going to discuss FERPA and also how it relates to technology and the various technologies that we use and the considerations that we need to have regarding FERPA. There we go. All right, what exactly is FERPA? How many of you are, and hope most of you at least are pretty familiar with FERPA, how many of you have actually had FERPA training as part of your, okay. How many of you who have access to student records but have not had FERPA training that you didn't recall? Okay, so maybe a few. But essentially, FERPA, also known as the Buckley Amendment, is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, originally passed in 1974, but there have been amendments, of course, since then. It applies to all educational institutions that are receiving federal funding. And that means actually even K through 12, up through higher ed. It doesn't apply to, well, if you're a private institution, it doesn't apply to you. However, if you are receiving federal funding, then it does apply to you. And most institutions, whether it's grants or through federal financial aid funds, are receiving financial aid funds, and so therefore are subject to the FERPA laws. Why was it enacted? It was enacted out of a growing concern with privacy considerations in the 1970s as technology was increasing and considerations. Concerns were growing in regard to data that the government had access to and that the government was maintaining, and the privacy rights of certain individuals. Under FERPA, institutions are required to provide privacy protection for the education records that maintain. So FERPA specifically, obviously there are federal privacy laws that relate to the individual person who may not be affiliated with an institution, but FERPA specifically safeguards the education records that are maintained by the institution. Education records are actually anything that is directly related to the student, as well as and that is maintained by the particular institution. It affords college and university students the rights to inspect and review their records, the right to correct them if they see an error in them. And the important piece here is that it affords them the right to control the disclosure of personally identifiable information contained in their records. And that type of information can include the student ID number, their name, their email addresses, photographs, anything that is, again, that by which they can be identified. How many of you have access to student ID numbers, for instance? Anyone have access to social security numbers? I think most people have moved away from the social security number and college and university policies. In addition to FERPA, though, there may also be state and college university policy that protects privacy in certain educational records. For instance, in the state of Florida, we have a pretty liberal open records law. You can pretty much access anything, certainly in public institutions. However, state statutes protect applicant records. So, because in Florida, if you typically, because of the sunshine laws, you can access that information, but because it's not protected, applicant records aren't protected under FERPA because the student has, or the person actually hasn't become a student until they've actually enrolled in the institution. And so therefore, those aren't protected under FERPA, but they can be protected by the state, or they could also be protected by university policy. The University of Florida has policies, has college and university policies that actually mirror FERPA, so it also applies, or also allows for that double protection there. Let's see. In terms of disclosures and exceptions, before disclosing education records, an institution must usually obtain a signed and dated release from the student before any of this information can be disclosed. The important piece about FERPA, too, is that it allows an institution to release the information. It doesn't mandate that they do that. So, for instance, sometimes I work in the Office of Student Affairs, and I have access to everything imaginable within a student record. For instance, I have access to grades. A lot of you probably don't have access to grades, but so I have a little more access to some of that information. Obviously, names, email addresses, but sometimes, for instance, and I've done this before, I've gotten a random phone call from, it can be someone from the general public, asking for information about a particular student. Like, let's say their phone number or their email address or something like that. I'll ask them, well, what is the purpose that you're asking, why are you asking for this information? And if I'm not satisfied with why they're asking it from, or if they're not from an organization where I feel comfortable releasing information, I won't release the information. Because I don't have to release it. I may, but I don't have to release it. And that, for me, again, I work in student services, is also more of a protection for our students. It's a safeguard what I view as their personal safety, or could be their personal safety, but also their privacy. Now, however, there are exceptions, and the important one is directory information. How many of you are familiar with the directory information from your particular institution? Okay, a good number. Directory information is the information from the student's education record that may be released without receiving that signed release. So, for instance, at the University of Florida, name, email address, telephone number, height and weight of athletes, believe it or not, can be released to the general public. I looked up Toro Law. Some of they have a few different pieces of directory information that can be released. And that's the other important piece that you should be aware of, is that each institution defines what is directory information. Now, the one piece I will say is that obviously you can't list social security numbers as directory information. There are some limitations, but for instance, Toro Law, I looked up their directory information earlier today and noticed that their student IDs are considered directory information. Photographs are considered directory information. So if there's a request for that, the institution may release that information. At UF, we don't, for instance, the distinction obviously is photographs. We don't consider photographs as directory information. And so before we can release that to anyone who's asking, including to our own faculty members, we have to get a signed release from a particular student. The other piece, of course, is other school officials who have a legitimate educational interest. So for instance, sometimes I'll get a faculty member who will call me up and say, hey, I'm writing a letter of recommendation. This student, and now granted, they could still be in their particular education records that they've kept, but if they don't have easy access to them, they'll call me up because I have access to grades and say, what did so-and-so who was in my class in this particular semester have? What grade did they receive and what semester were they in my class? They're asking that for a legitimate educational purpose, and so therefore I'll release the information. Now sometimes I'll have faculty members call me up and say, hey, I need so-and-so's transcript, and I'll say, no, you need to contact the student and ask them for their own transcript. I'm not just going to give you that information. Even when they do say, I'm writing a letter of recommendation for them, I'll say, no. The student, if they're writing a letter of recommendation, they can provide the faculty member with that information. And then the other piece in which we're getting ready to segue into Jenny's portion, and it's important too, are contractors, consultants, or other parties, agents to whom an institution has outsourced institutional services or functions. So we're thinking of, let's say, ExamSoft, Westlaw, Lexis, I know Exam4, I saw them out there, Bloomberg, all of these outside parties who many of our institutions work with to fulfill our educational mission. And what's important is that these outside parties can be considered school officials for purposes of FERPA. They're performing an institutional service. They need to be under the direct control of the institution, and then also therefore they're subject to the requirements. The other important piece here is that educational institutions and agencies must also use reasonable methods to ensure that school officials obtain access to only those educational records in which they have that legitimate educational interest. So just because they have access to that information doesn't mean they necessarily need to access it. For instance, I have access to all kinds of information at the University of Florida, but it doesn't mean that I can look up Emmett Smith's educational record and look up his grades and see what his final GPA was, even though I do have access to that information, because I don't have a legitimate educational interest in doing so. And now I will hand it over to Jenny.
Hello. Are you still awake? I hope so. So let's talk about online storage. How many of you have used one of these online storage technologies? Dropbox is one of my favorites. SkyDrive, you've got a Surface tablet. I hear they try to force you to use that. Those kinds of things. So these services are fantastic. I love Dropbox. Our faculty members love these kinds of technologies, but there's one problem, and actually if you go to the Dropbox terms of service, they will actually state not FERPA compliant. So that means no grade information, things like that should be stored on these kinds of services. Anything that relates to student data should not be stored on these kinds of services. There's only one problem, and that is this. iPads, Surface tablets, things like that. What's the easiest way to transfer files to these kinds of technology? It's not iTunes, I can tell you that. It's Dropbox, and we have faculty members who are doing great things. They want to try to grade paperlessly these days. And they are trying to use iAnnotate, things like that, but then they want to transfer via Dropbox. Just drag it into the computer, upload it to their iPad, grade away in PDF, transfer it over through their course management system, done. Only problem is we have problems with FERPA and our state laws as well. So, this is one thing we have been trying to educate our faculty on. And so it's one thing we all have to worry about with the online storage systems, is that you really have to watch. There are 2 exceptions, and they're peeking out around the corner, and this is only if you have contracts with them. Does anyone have a faculty agreement with Google Apps or Microsoft in the room? Do their universities? You may, because I haven't seen the contract, but you may actually get around this because they actually have some agreements for using the online storage with the faculty. They've released it first for the students, but there are some agreements for the faculty now, I'm told. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to look at the contracts for that because UF doesn't have that. I don't know if that's coming or not.
The Office 365 for all the students.
Will it come for the faculty though? That's the question.
Well, grad students or
Maybe in the future.
quasi.
So those may be your only exceptions, is if your schools are contracting with those. And that is the key to FERPA, is you have to have the contract clauses in your contract to give you the direct control over your independent contractors. Because that's what these services are, is they're independent contractors. And Dropbox does not like to play nice. Now, there is a new Dropbox for business, and they may eventually get there, but they aren't there yet. So, the next service, we're going to talk about course management. How many of you guys have people who use course management systems such as Twen? Web courses? I think pretty much everybody does. We use Sakai as well at our school, although more people use Twen than anything else. Course management systems obviously give you a broad variety of services such as discussion boards, the lessons, document distribution, etc. So our faculty love these items. I love these items. I'm currently teaching a course through Sakai. They're fantastic systems. They make life much easier. But again, they're independent contractors. So as independent contractors, we need to make sure that we have contracts in place to cover ourselves when we're looking at FERPA. Carrie and I had the luxury of taking some time to look through the Lexis and West contracts this year, and we discovered that the contracts that the university signed do not cover Twen or web courses. They're contracts with the individuals, and they have no FERPA clauses in them. So, unfortunately, there are some issues that we're working on. We're talking with Twen and Westlaw, but I highly recommend you take a look at your contracts. So, right now, we're talking with our deans about what to do with that, and talking with University Council. But again, it's something you have to make sure that you have control over your independent contractors. We were in session this morning talking about Twitter and Paperly and all of these great services out there for social media. People were saying, oh, we're putting all these pictures of our students and all of these things on there. Again, make sure that your student data is not being put on social media services that you don't have contracts with. Check your student data make sure you have contracts with your independent contractors if you're putting your student information out there. So, it looks like we have about 16 and a half minutes left. We have some precautions for you. Make sure you work with your general counsel's office and review your service agreements. That's the big one that we've learned. Keep FERPA contract clauses on hand. There are some sample agreements out there that are easy to find. And Carrie, what's the name of, is it McDonald that is the gentleman who has all the FERPA contract clauses? Mhm. I think it's McDonald who has all of the contract clauses out there. Keep up to date with FERPA changes. They change every year. Someone in your university should be keeping up to date. Know what your university considers directory information. It's posted on a website. Okay? And stop and think as to who is going to have access to your student data and for what purposes. One of the things that your twin or whoever's running your Westlaw account is going to have access to, they have access to your course rolls. They're going to know who's enrolled in your evidence class if you have your course on Twin. It's not something they need to know. So just think about what's happening there. So, that's all for our end. We'll take questions now for all three of us. Do you have them?
If I could, can I go back one? If I could just add a little bit to that really great presentation, thank you. I wanted to just share a few more options for people who may be looking for Dropbox-like functionality, not necessarily wanting to worry about these things. Certainly, with a service like Dropbox, although I'm not sure whether it would pass FERPA muster, it is possible to encrypt the files using something like TrueCrypt before you store them, and then they're inaccessible even if someone could get access to your Dropbox. But beyond that, if you're looking for simply more controlled, more convenient, one of the things that I've recently come across, and I'm actually testing with some folks at Cali, is something called OwnCloud. OWNCLOUD. And essentially, there is a commercial version of it, but it also is an open source software package that one may legally download and set up locally that gives you the essentially a private Dropbox capability. All the things that Dropbox can do. Mobile clients, directories on your computer for easy, all that automatic synchronization stuff. But instead of pointing to some server farm, who knows in where, owned by someone else, that software can be pointing to a server farm or a storage unit in your building that you control. So that is one possible, if you have the infrastructure, the bandwidth, and the IT support to manage that, you could do it on your own. Or you could set up a hosted solution for some amount of money that, if you look at the difference between the pricing per seat of Dropbox Professional versus OwnCloud, the numbers are very different. And the other thing I wanted to just let people know about, and this may be more of a smaller scale, is something that I use called PogoPlug, which is an appliance. I don't mean like kitchen appliance, but it's a little device, and it connects to a network connection. And you plug USB drives into it. I think there are professional versions as well. But once you've done that, those are cloud drives. And again, they can be looked at on your computer as virtual, they can be on mobile. But if you have someone who needs to set up a sort of smaller scale cloud storage solution, you can literally buy a 3 terabyte drive. If you think about the cost for Dropbox of 3 terabytes, 3 terabyte drive from the Best Buy down the street, and the PogoPlug, which starts somewhere in the $25 to $40 range. Hook it up to the network, and they will have worldwide access to that specific drive. It is a very nice little small-scale solution. I also wanted to at least briefly point out that FERPA is not the only law to which, with which we need to comply. Massachusetts, for example, has data encryption requirements, which may be of relevance. And also, don't forget your site, your school's privacy policy. What are you saying on your website about the information you're collecting and how you are using it? If that's not consistent with what you're actually doing, that in itself can expose your organization to FTC and attorneys general and other sorts of things, even if what you're doing is otherwise legal. So don't forget all that other privacy compliance. And with that, we're happy to take questions.
So you said that we've had challenges with contract language for LexisNexis and Westlaw, which I find interesting because they're offering all these course management tools to all these institutions. So if they correct for one institution, do you think that they'll go across and correct for others, or do you think that the institution has to prompt them to do that?
We're not sure. We would hope that they would correct for all of them. We do have a paper in the works where we are planning on publishing proposed language, which we would hope would help other institutions.
But for instance, we actually, in preparing for that paper, we actually had a conference call with Lex's general counsel, and we actually asked them about FERPA, and the general counsel actually kind of seemed like, it seemed as if they didn't know what that was, or they didn't know what we were talking about. And I specifically asked them, I said, well, do you provide FERPA training for your employees? And then at the time they said they couldn't tell me that information, and I kind of said, really?
I mean, keep in mind, right, although we use them for education is a modest, minor part of their business.
Right.
We are the kindergartners being hit by drug pushers. They're in our institutions in order to addict our students to their services so that they will go off into the world and pay for it.
Which is why we as administrators, faculty, staff, as the custodians of these educational records need to safeguard against these things. As Jonathan was talking about different other privacy considerations, the other issue, as he was talking about, who knows where their server could be international. That poses a problem. If all of our student data is held internationally, what happens when we no longer use LexisNexis or Twin? When we move away from that, is that data still ours, or are they claiming it as their own? And so those are some of the other considerations that that we were running into and discovering that, they get or have access to all of our student educational records, but then are we therefore maintaining that, or do we get them back if for some reason we no longer use them as a resource?
Other questions?
With regards to the new Dropbox for Business service, we started actually looking at that, and do you know what the sticking point is on FERPA compliance with that service? Because they do provide now encryption both on their servers and the traffic between any client and their servers.
I don't, the FERPA provisions actually generally have to be negotiated between the actual institution and the independent contractor. So you would actually have to put the contract provisions in your contract with Dropbox. I don't know if they're willing to. UF, as far as I know, has not looked into setting up an agreement with Dropbox. So that's something that you'd have to contact Dropbox and see if they're willing to do.
So you would need to add explicit FERPA-related provisions in the contract regardless.
Right. Google Apps for Students has actually taken that step and put in actual FERPA contract language to the point where they don't actually provide advertisements to students and things like that until after they become alumni or no longer students, things like that. All I know is Dropbox is not FERPA compliant. I'm not quite sure why they aren't FERPA compliant. I think part of it is in their free version they aren't willing to negotiate individually. If they are willing to negotiate on the business-to-business end, then you could probably work it into your contract.
And there may be a difference between functionally FERPA compliant and explicitly warranting that they're FERPA compliant. They may check all the boxes, but if they're not willing to outright and say, we commit to complying with this particular law, that may not be sufficient.
Right, and if they're not willing to be under your direct control, then for the FERPA purposes, then they're not FERPA compliant.
Other questions? Yep.
Well, thank you all for coming, we
Yep.
really appreciate it.
Okay, we are still. He's actually set up all that room hours, can't play with it much, but it's got all the functionality, it's open source. You have to be, so you just have to be willing, you have to have enough bandwidth.
It's not only for I'm just saying that.
Right, so what's nice about this is you don't have to build the software.
Right.
And, you know, you can have a directory, there's lots of out there, that is no software, right there. You know? And it's the C colon, you know, just six directions,
Right.
just like Dropbox. So.
They actually they don't think the text was
If you know, Actually, but I talked to her a little bit. I was very I actually do know why. Because they went into they went into my, not my spam filter, but my spam filter wall. For some reason, I figured out why. It's there, I'm sure it's there somewhere.
So if you'd like to, review that.
I really appreciate that. Thank you. You're very welcome.
Yes.
We've also had issues with our students, support programs. They weren't, then they were. Now I think that's CCS, West Palmetto, or something like that. Came to your Is there a confidentiality provision, including in terms of the agreement, in the agreement? Oh my God. Of course, even if they could, one quick freedom of information, that's how Apple's iOS, when the app developer contract is massively one. And someone says, oh, that's what we want, I'm going to do an installation request right there. Got it? So what you're saying is you're very disinfected.
Yes. Anyone on the street? Yeah, it is Yeah, he doesn't.